class is coming to an end, I want to spend the last moments to look at some generalities of 19th century changes that have lasting effects into our country and culture today. Now, if you look at the first half of the 19th century, the first half of the 1800s, those were decades of peace leading up to the American Civil War. The American Civil War being from 1861 to 1865. But in those decades leading up to that conflict, Americans had an opportunity to consolidate the territories they've already had. They've already won in wars, taken by force, or politically maneuvered in political dealings such as the Louisiana Purchase and so forth. Now, as settlers were pushing westward, as traders were now sailing around the world in global trade, at the same time, American control of the land within its own boundaries already contained became and remained incomplete and a huge area of tension. How do these new territories become states? And how does the idea of manifest destiny, the sort of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age of spreading westward as a God-given right, that going across political divides on every area of the culture of expansion of this new young country, but at the same time with ideas of expansion, the ideas of manifest destiny, the tension lies in slavery. And how would these new territories deal with the issue of slavery? How does one state become a slave state and another become free? How does that look? And so focus on that tension as you skim the reading here at the end and how that works out and plays together in the story of expansion. It's important to consider that at the same time Americans were expanding westward to the Pacific, across the Atlantic, a Christian revival movement was taking shape across Britain and North America, known as the Second Great Awakening. In this movement, evangelical Christians on both sides of the Atlantic exchanged ideas and inspired a broad set of social, cultural, and political changes in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s that had lasting effects well into the 20th century. Here, a new sense of responsibility of Christians to improve and uplift their society around them and build a new Christian nation began to take shape. And a new rising power in forms of abolition movements, the freeing of slaves, but also women's rights, looking at women's issues, started to become part of this new evangelical Christian movement of the country. But also we have the middle of this industrial revolution, and so you have classes developing and labor issues developing that also takes shape inside the Second Great Awakening. At the same time, too, political parties started to use Christian ideals more connected to politics and in changes of social reform, and you get different parties that come about, like the Free Soil Party and the Liberty Party, to help make changes for one way or the other, but through the same ideals of this evangelical Christian movement that was sweeping the land. Now, despite all these things in the 19th century, the first half of the 1800s, it all came to a head with the paradox of slavery. The clash of slavery, this old archaic system. Remember, throughout history, there's been a sense of slavery. There's been a sort of slavery. Arguably, the transatlantic slave system is different than past slave systems in ancient Greece or ancient Rome. But now, in the 19th century, in the United States, this slave system clashed with new ideals and ideas of modernity, new ways of industrialization that started to really rear its head in challenging this old system by the 1850s. Many, even in the 18th century, in the late 1700s, the founding fathers included, believed that the slave system would disappear over time. It would eventually go away. Abolition would happen naturally. But in other countries, the abolition movement was well underway. Slavery being abolished in many places around the world before the United States, the world condemning it as inhumane. as ethically, religiously, whatever reason, as problematic and against norms, inhumane, but also economically inefficient, with rising technology and the Industrial Revolution proving to be more cost effective. So beyond the ethical aspects, there was a cost effectiveness of the economy itself, showing how slavery was inefficient. Most famously, Adam Smith, in his famous book Wealth of Nations, coming out in 1776, talked about and argued for the inefficiency of the slave system. So rather than arguing for just ethic reasons behind it, he's saying this is not a viable system for your economics to be built upon. Now, at the same time, supporters through the 1800s in the United States had defended with elaborate intellectual religious justifications and political decisions still being enforced to uphold the strength of the slave system. Most famously or infamously, you have the Dred Scott decision in 1857. You have various fugitive slave acts that play a huge role in how runaway slaves, or slaves that cross that border, the Mason-Dixon line, how to retrieve them. Or going into free territories, free states or territories, and how to be able to get your slave back. The Dred Scott decision being a big part of that. So be sure to read about that. In other ways, the Compromise of 1850, which on one side allowed for the creation of the new state, California, to become a free state. At the same time, the compromise, among many things, was that slave trading was allowed to remain in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. being a free area, a slave-free area, but a free state. But slave trading was allowed to remain there. And the Fugitive Slave Acts were allowed to cross in there. So if you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, that's what's happening in that story, based on true story, where a free slave, not a free person, African American born in a free state, was taken out and removed and brought into slavery. So there's a lot of that happening, where you're able to use the system, able to use the political gains to justify and to uphold the structures of slavery. Now, all this tension in up until the 1850s and in the beginning of the 1860s sparked with the new direction of the bloodiest battle, the bloodiest war in American history, which only lasted 4 years, which isn't a lot of time considering how much damage was created with the American Civil War. In fact, with all the conflicts of U.S. combat combined, all U.S. conflicts combined, they still don't add up even close to the number of dead Americans, U.S. soldiers killed in the American Civil War, with over 600,000 casualties. In fact, more POWs, more prisoners of war, died in the prisoner camps in the Civil War than American soldiers that died in Vietnam. To show how much, and this was a total war, everybody was affected. And the lasting legacies of the war led to a long, hard, conflicting Reconstruction period through the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, and still arguably with lasting effects today. With the post-slavery country, how to deal with African Americans, how to deal with the new country with tensions that were well established before the Civil War and just didn't go away certainly not with the Emancipation Proclamation, and certainly even with the signing of the end of the war. It still had its tensions and conflicts. But unfortunately, that is something we're going to discuss in the next class if you take History 17B, and looking at the Reconstruction, looking at the new and revived anxieties carried over after the Civil War and into the 20th century.